Well, it was 1980 when I received possibly the greatest Christmas present that I have ever received. Now, my parents had spent the summer looking for and purchasing a used motorcycle. And what they ended up finding was a 1968 Honda Mini Trail, a monkey bike. They spent the summer months restoring it and cleaning it up and getting it in almost showroom condition for me, checking through all the systems, making sure all the lights worked, all of that, so that on Christmas Day, I was presented with something that was truly amazing for a 10-year-old boy. Now, I don't believe my parents fully understood or appreciated what that gift really meant to me. It provided me with the benchmark to learn the skills that I have today. Things like adjusting carburetors, changing oil, adjusting chains, and fixing damaged tires. All of those things that young kids get into. Well, I learned those skill sets, and I still use those skill sets today in my tinker shed. Now, if you went to buy a Honda Mini Trail today, well, they're quite expensive. They become pretty much a collector's item. But fortunately, there has been an influx of Chinese clone motorcycles over the last couple decades. This BAJA 50 behind me is a good example of that. Now, this bike is pretty much a Yamaha PW80 chassis with a Honda 50cc engine inside of it. It has a semi-automatic transmission, meaning you get to shift gears, but the person doesn't necessarily have to learn how to use clutch control yet. They're fairly powerful, it'll pull my weight around, and they're fairly reliable. All of the engineering was done by Yamaha and Honda, and these Chinese companies essentially just cloned them after the patents were up, I suppose. Now, these are relatively inexpensive. You can get them for under a few $100s, especially if, like this one, it has a few things wrong with it that you need to tinker on. Now, over the next few episodes, I'm going to take this bike and see if I can get it to a better condition so that someone else can enjoy it. I'm obviously a little bit too big to ride this thing, but I thought it would be an interesting project to share with everybody out there on YouTube. And hopefully, if you find it interesting, you'll go out and look for one of these things and spend the time to make your kids' dreams come true. And who knows, maybe you'll set them on a path that you weren't expecting. So sit back, grab something cold to drink, and enjoy today's show on Dino's Tinker Shed. Boy, oh boy, does this thing ever bring back memories. Although it's not a Honda Trail 50, its size and scale really is reminiscent of it. And sitting next to my DR650, well, it's pretty hilarious to actually see how small this thing really is. Now, interestingly enough, I put fuel in this bike, and after a couple kicks, it started right up. Now, it idles a little bit rough here. I know I'm going to have to pull the carburetor apart, but I was still amazed with the fact that it was running, and I couldn't resist taking this thing for a ride. Now, my 250-pound frame bottoms out right on the tire here, and I have to figure out that I got to sit so far forward just so that the suspension won't bottom out and hit the tire. So eventually I figure it out, and off I go riding around the backyard. I'm 10 years old again in my head here. It's pretty fun. Now, after a couple hot laps, I bring it back in, and I do realize at this point that, well, the automatic clutch is holding up a little bit, and I'm having a bit of a hard time getting it into neutral here. I finally do get it in, but probably the RPMs are running a little bit high, and maybe the clutch itself isn't set up quite right, but we'll address that in the future videos. Right now, I just want to get all the plastics off it and get this thing cleaned up. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is take the seat off, which at this point is held on with a couple zip ties. At some point, the rear plastics were damaged on this, and that included the mount for the seat. Now, after this, I'm going to pull the tank off. So I'm going to start by pulling off the fuel hose here. And a lot of the times on these old bikes, these fuel lines get so hard they're difficult to pull off by hand. So I'm going to try it here. I think I have the petcock in the off position, but I really don't. And of course it's so tight that I can't get it off. So I'm just going to use a pair of side cutters here and sort of pry it off till I can get it moving, and then I'll pull it out. And you're going to see right away that fuel starts dripping out. So I'm thinking, of course, it's in the on position, so I start turning it and I realize the petcock just will not turn off. So I'm going to slide the pipe back on, the fuel pipe there, and I'm going to pull the whole tank off. So there's a couple 10mm bolts on the front of this tank that hold it in place. Not really a lot. Once I get the tank bolts out, I just pull the fuel pipe off again, and now I can take the tank safely outside and store it so it won't leak. I'm going to turn my attention to the front fender here. Now, the front fender is in pretty good shape. It's really the only piece of plastic other than the tank that isn't damaged. And looking at the back pieces that came in a bag, you can see they're in pretty rough shape. I'm going to try to clean these up and see if I can mount them without having to buy new plastics. Call me cheap, but it doesn't cost anything for me to try. So I finally get the rest of that fender off, and all the plastics are now safely in a bag. Overall, I think the frame is in pretty good shape. It's a little bit dirty, but we're going to wash it anyway. And all the parts seem to be in place. Now, everything seems straight and true other than a couple little brackets that have been bent. So I'm pretty happy with that. The exhaust heat shroud here is missing all the bolts, but I can replace those. And I'm going to start by taking out these seat retaining bolts that obviously were snapped off by someone probably my size playing around on this bike. And I'm going to keep the plastic here just in case I decide I want to use it to try and glue it back in. I doubt that's going to be the route I take, but it's easier to have it than not have it. And I can always dispose of it at a later time. And now I'm going to focus on getting the exhaust off. Overall, it's in good shape. It's not bent. It's a little bit rusty, but we're going to paint that up. And we're going to pull out the 3 or 4 bolts that hold it on. I'm going to take the stinger off first and set that aside. And then I'm going to go up front. Now, I always cringe when I have to take off exhaust manifold bolts, but these ones were actually pretty good. And I sometimes think that these castle style nuts here, these Eggcorn nuts, actually help protect the studs from rusting. I was able to loosen them off a little bit and just undo them with my fingers. And that may also be an indication that this bike hasn't seen a lot of use. There's not a lot of rust on these studs. I was very, very much pleased. That just leaves one bolt right up on top of the frame here that I'm going to take out. And then the whole exhaust assembly will come off. Looks pretty good. And now it's going to try to get this airbox out, but to do that we have to take the carb off. So it definitely seems like the airbox is held on with one 10mm bolt that's in behind, sort of tucked inside there. So I think what makes the most sense now is just to take the carburetor off completely. And that way I can get to the airbox bolt. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take off, if I can, well, maybe I'll start up here. Take these guys off and see if I can't wiggle the carburetor out. We'll see. Once I get this last bolt out between the intake and the carburetor, I'm going to pull this spacer out. You're going to see on this spacer there's actually a ring on it, and that ring faces the carburetor. When you reinstall it, the flat side faces the intake. I'm going to then take a screwdriver and loosen off the band clamp that holds the carburetor into the air boot on the air box. And with just a little bit of wiggling and sheningling here, I'm able to pop the carburetor out. Now I finally decided I was going to take the intake off, and after a few nervous minutes of breaking the bolts free, they did come out. I just thread them out by hand here, And I use a dead blow hammer gently to loosen the intake from the gasket. And luckily the gasket stayed in place on the engine itself. I can reuse this. Next, I'm going to take the top of the carburetor off. This big aluminum nut just unthreads, and it allows you to pull out both the round slide and the needle valve here. And I just set those aside and let them hang. But first, I put them into a plastic bag. This is a little trick I learned from a mechanic. And these slide lock bags work really well. Next, I'm going to take a 10mm socket on an extension and reach in and take out the one bolt that holds the airbox in place. It's a little tough. I've got fairly big hands, but I do manage to get in there and get it out. And just to keep the bolt and nut around, I put them together. Now I did pull out the spark plug here too. I just broke this free with a ratchet, and now I'm just going to thread it out by hand. Now the plug's remarkably clean. There's not a lot of rust or anything on it, but it is fairly black down at the electrode. I'm going to have to do a little bit of research and figure out what's going on here. More than likely it's running rich. And while I'm at it, I thought I might as well drop the oil out. I want to change the oil anyway, and I do need to get into the clutch to inspect that. So I'm just going to pop this out. And it's really hard to see here, but the oil is really, really dark. It's just hard to see against the oil pan here. Well, I think this is as good a place as any to stop this particular episode. We were able to get a lot of things accomplished. We were able to determine that the bike itself runs, and it runs reasonably well. I couldn't believe it. It shifts gears, the brakes work. I think we've got a very good base engine here to work on. Now, we were also able to strip off all of the plastics, sort of make a list of things that we need to do, and also we were able to take off the carburetor and the exhaust to have a look around. The carburetor looks like it's pretty clean. Now we also drained the oil and pulled the spark plug, and this gave us our first indication into the condition of this engine. The oil was black as black can be, leading me to believe it's probably never been changed, or maybe once long time ago. And the spark plug was pretty black, meaning that probably it's either burning really, really rich, or it's getting some oil coming across the rings. We could have some sticky rings up in there. Either way, I'm going to have to pull off the clutch cover. Now, I was going to do this anyway, just to have a look at the clutch. But the interesting thing about these little 50cc engines, or 49cc engines, is that the clutch pack is also your oil filter. So we'll have to clean that and reuse it. But that is for another episode, not this one. And until then, I hope that you have some fun out in your shop as much as I do in mine. And I will see you soon, I hope, back here on Dino's Tinker Shed.